Okay, so we have our Monday Learn Together. So from here on out, and this is our second week, really what I would term our third week in a regular 18-week class. And again, I'm trying to emphasize the idea that we're in a short-term class running all the content you would get in an 18-week semester. So it's very compressed. And so from here on out, and just to show you this, right, is that you will have each week. Last week we only had a code along for Monday, and that's because of the setup of the environment. We have a code along and a learn together for that first week, and now from here on out, you'll have code alongs and learn together every week. Okay, so looking at this item here, so here's what you're going to do. Let me go over, just talk about it for a minute, and then because you'll have another video to help you do setting up outputting to the browser. So this video is the one you're watching now. So what you want to do is create a new folder in your public repo and name it W2M, which is week 2 Monday. Okay. So just to be clear, and I'm going to move over to the editor for a second. And I've already done mine, but I just want to show you here. Right. So right now in my public repo, right, I have 3 folders. And this is the one from last week. Now, last week you weren't required to have the index and the app.js. This week you will. You probably just had one JS file. But what you might want to do, and this is how I did it, is start by creating that new folder. So remember, this is the file. And again, if you hold over there for a second, it actually gives you a little, what we call a tooltip. And here's your folder. So make sure if you're here, when you create that, you can see what it'll do is going to put it at that same level. And that's what you want to do here. Now, by the way, with Git, and just a side note, and I may change this after our first dev, is we can use branches here. And branches are another way that you branch off, meaning you create new, you take the code and you create something from there. And this kind of would be a logical place to do that. And I guess I hesitate a little bit throwing too much just because I know this is a bit of a jump just doing Git on from week 1. But, if you want to try branching, do. All right, so you name it W2M and you take the code you wrote from last week and you implement at least two functions. Now, as a caveat, one of those functions can't be counted as the one you're going to need to output to the browser. So what you end up really with is 3, but 2 of them you have to write from the code you did last week. Now, it may mean you need to expand your code, which is fine. I ended up doing that, right? So I think what I'll do also, I'm just looking at this ahead, is I'm going to cover these concepts in the attendance. But I will talk about return values because I'm going to just for a second here talk about just an overview of some of the stuff that you've learned. Okay, so I'm going to switch over. Actually, before they do that, let's look at this, right? So in this code along, we've learned the basics of how to set up functions. We'll talk about signature in a minute, the undefined and the null and the difference in how to use them, multiple arguments and default argument or setting defaults, which is such an important thing, scope and how to understand scope, very much like when we did the if blocks, template strings, which is a new way to output, which by the way, I would say from here on out, use template strings. And then this idea of this example, this challenge of building the calculator. For sure, give yourself some time when he gives you a challenge to actually attempt that on your own before you actually see his code and then learn from the example. That's actually one of the things because I was just kind of playing around and with the calculator after he did it. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is how I did it. And realizing like it's so good to see somebody else's code after, even before, but especially after you've attempted it. Okay. All right. So let me move over to here to my editor. And I created in that directory, I just created another JS file because I was going to play around with a minute, but I'll come back to my code in a second. But in here, right, one thing you see is like he's using let. And I would tell you, and there's other actually ways to write functions. I'll show you that in a sec. But for our class, one of the things that I would say I want to see because it's the style guide that we're going to be our style guide of using and writing functions, is I'm going to call these const. And this is just another way to define a variable. In this case, it's different than let, because let you can actually redefine, const you can't. And just think about it, you wouldn't want a function name to be declared twice. You really wouldn't want a variable defined twice, but I'm just going to say name func, right? Equals, I'm just making up. Again, this is the idea of, not again, but it's camel case, right? So function, right? So this is a some function signature, right? This is its basic structure. So before, when we were writing code that was just running out on the global space, now we have a function that has its own scope and that can be called many times with whatever we want to have run in this function, whatever code we have. And we can or cannot return, we can or we don't have to return values, but it is very common to return values. Okay. But I want to talk about, because it's just good to understand for a second here, right? And maybe this is yeah. So this is actually another way you can see JavaScript write functions in JavaScript, is just call it function, give it a name, But for our class, I want you to know, use const, give it a name, equals, right? So even though you will see this out there, the style I want you to use is what you see written in this course, and it's one of the ways, right, I look at and evaluate your code. So in this case, when we pass something as arguments, and those arguments become parameters into the function. Okay. So, and I know when you first code, this can take a minute to understand. So name func, I'm going to call name func. And if I pass something into it, whatever it is, right? So if I pass a string into it, okay, by the way, let's just go ahead and talk about using from here on out, just easier, template strings. Now, in this case, I'm not really using any more of the functionality of template strings, right? But in here, right, what happens is, because my function is not passing in a parameter, even though I'm calling it with an argument, and you can just think of that as I'm passing something to the function, right? So you could say here, but it's not a value, but it doesn't really matter because you're just naming it, right? You could say text, which kind of makes, this is where you can give it any name, but you want to give it a name that makes more sense for what it is, right? And then if I said console.log test or text, then it would output that, okay? In this case, I'm not so we can run that, it totally works. Just to, by the way, just to reiterate, I'm going to run this without the browser, right? Just because it's quick. I'm going to do signature. Good. This is fun. But because I'm calling it, I'm doing something. In this case is very simple. I'm not returning anything, right? If I was to define it, I would say let something equal, right? What would, in this case, what would happen? It would still print, but if I tried to console log something, what would that be? What's your guess? What would that be? Right? Undefined, because I haven't returned it, right? So if I do return and I say, is now I can determine, say text really is, this is fun. Let's make this more sense. It really is, right? Now what will happen is I'm passing in this string to here. I'm returning it. I'm taking that string that got passed in. I'm adding some more string content to it, and then I'm returning it. But I could be doing this with values. Okay. So I just want you now, by the way, you should know what that's, right? Because in this case, we're using the template strings and doing that. Okay, so I just want to talk about that for a minute, because I want you to learn not just how to use functions, but how to return something so that you can use it later. Very common. Okay. All right. So now let me just close this for a second. I'm going to go ahead and open my app.js. And in this case, you'll learn about, again, watch the other video, because this time you are required to use output to the page. So I wrote 2 functions. I took my code from last week. I played around with it a little bit, right? I have determine morning task. I have determine time before gym. And I know when you're looking at this code, because the next thing I'm going to show you, and this is really, it's like not only writing functions, but walking through the code is what I want you to learn this week. Because once you start writing functions, from here on out, you want to know how to watch how your code is actually running. Okay. So rather than to do it here, what I'm going to do is actually, now, again, I talked about this, you could just open this on your file system, just open your index.html. I just like to run this live server. If you want to know about that, I talked about that a little last week. So here's my actual output. So I'm using the browser like console.log. And this is what I want you to do. I want you to right click, because I'm going to end up giving you my link. Okay. I'm right clicking. I did that kind of quick, so let me do it one more time. So once I either run something to run a server, or I just open that file, that index file on my local system, then I right click and I hit inspect. And then in here, there's a lot of stuff, right? So what I want you to do is just look across the top. And by the way, yours could be lower. It could be lower, right? There's ways that you could, where is this toggle the bar, right? So we could have this in and out. You could change the responsiveness here. Yours could show up on the bottom. But what I want you to do is find source. And source in this case, click on, it actually already shows, but app.js. And the reason mine shows is that it was already up there. So here's what I want you to do. And I want you to do this with my code and with yours. So what I have here is I have a function, show on page. I have a function, determine time before gym. A function, determine morning task. I should have an S there. And then I have some code, right? Some actual commands, not code, it's all code, but I have actual JavaScript commands out on the global, right? So these are functions, they have their own scope. And now what I do is I set a variable on the global scope, time before gym, right? And what I do is determine, I run a function, I pass in 3 arguments. And if you come up here, you can see it. Now, where this gets kind of hard, and this is what I want you to do this, is come over to the other side and click here. And from here on out, what I want you to do is actually study what my code is doing, and then it will help you write your own. Learning how to watch how somebody else's code works is so valuable. And you might wonder, Rio, why didn't we set it up here? We could totally have set this breakpoint, and a breakpoint is no more than telling the code to stop executing. All right. So I'm going to click here again. If I click there, but I wouldn't, because I want it, and I could set another one, but in this case, I only want one, and you'll see why in a minute. So now I come up here, I refresh, right? And what happens is the browser is now suspended, right? So now I can watch, and this is the key up here. Okay, so I can step into the next function. I can step out of the current function. I can step over, and in this case, most of what I want you to do at the beginning is just step. All that means is execute this line. So right now, and if you scroll over, okay, you can see right now there's nothing in. And how do I know there's nothing there? Because if it did, it would show up, and I'll explain this by watching it happen. Okay, again, we're paused in the browser. If I wanted it to execute, we could do it here, but I just come up here and I say step. So what does that do? It actually invoked this. It passed in these, right, parameters from these arguments. And now it's going to do some calculation. It's going to determine time. Now, and it does another logic check that say if there's, if it's my turn to drive, then it's going to subtract some more, and then it's going to return something. And when you hit step, now in this case, it's like it executed this and now it returns it. And now what happens is we're on the next line and I can determine by this execution, by this step by step, right? This dev tool is so helpful. I'm telling you, students, I know at first they're overwhelmed by this, but every student that has learned how to walk through their code like this becomes a better coder naturally. Just happens. Okay, so now I have a return value that I then do, I call show on page just for some content output. Okay, so again, use this step. Okay, so I have this text is equal to what I passed into it, right? The idea of here's just a string value that's getting passed into it. I'm going to hit step. Now, this is a little bit of a black box in that, I've talked about a little bit. We're going to learn about this later, and you can use it as a black box by just saying, okay, I'm going to do some work here, and then I'm going to come back. So it did that, and you can see over here what happens. So this is your task, is to actually, because I'll give you the link to my code. I'll show you just in a second this a little bit more. But I want you to learn how to set a breakpoint, and I would tell you to do it time before gym on line 34. I'll leave this code exactly as it is here, right? Refresh the page, hit step, and watch what happens in each step, and it will help you understand what I did so that you can inform you for what you need to do. Okay, so I've talked about most of this. This video really talks about this video is from last week where I showed you how to output to the browser, right? So you need to do that. That's going to be this week's work is for, because I didn't require it for last week, but I do require it for today. And I'll just show you a quick way you can do this after you watch this video that walks you through this in more steps, because I give you the Git hack link, but I talked about this. Like, here's my Git hack link from last week. Okay. And I've already pushed my code to GitHub. So what I can do is just take this and now figure out my new folder name, which in this case, if you remember right, I said W2M. It's still the index file. If I hit enter, then that's the URL that you submit for this week. Again, watch the other video to know in detail what's happening, at least somewhat, right? So when you submit, you're going to submit your link. Okay, so let me show you that. So what I'm going to do is come here, copy, because this is my, not just my code, right? Right. This is my output in the, well, I'm not going to write too much here. I'll just say my code, right? Now I tend to like to make this a little bigger. I'll make it a 3, right? Good, done. Cool, right? I'll write a little something, but I'm just showing you that's how you want to submit it. So there's a couple of steps you're doing here. You're taking code from last week. You're adding some functions, at least 2. You don't count the function for outputting on page because you didn't write that. At least one example of a return value, but both of my functions, and again, I'm giving you my code so that you can actually walk through using dev tools to understand what's happening to help you inform your writing of code. So if you're wondering, what does this mean, Rio, to write 2 functions? What does it mean to have return values and how do you use them? Okay, here's your example. Now, the thing I want to explain is I set a variable called time before gym. I ran a function. I returned a value. And then the next time I did it, I didn't have to say let because the variable is already defined. I just used it. Now, this time when I do it, it is going to be determined to be a different time before gym because I've sent different values to the function. I could have set up a different variable name, yeah, and then I would have had to have passed that to the determine morning task. Okay, so the more you study this, the more you understand it, the more it'll help you. I hope this video explains what you need to do this week. You do need to do 2 replies here to your fellow students. I'll put that in there. in your reply. Yeah, I'll make sure I update this, that you need to look at, first look at my code. So if I was to say step one, right, look at my code. I'm going to give you a link to it. Use the dev tools to walk through it. Then look at your own code from last week and start implementing two functions, right? Using at least return values on one and outputting it to the page. So a little bit of a challenge, which is good. When we challenge ourselves, we tend to learn a lot more. Hope this helps you out. Always, as usual, reach out if you need some help.